Good afternoon. I'm Keval Datani.
I'm Abdi Boué.
And I'm Natasha Riga-Jones, and welcome to Warwick Congress Weekly.
We're back after a mini break of sorts, and we hope all of you are having a great week so far and enjoyed your Easters. And while we've been away, there's certainly been no shortage of news stories that have sought our attention. So today we'll be discussing a lot from Daniel Ortega and the Nicaraguan anti-government protests. Tash will be looking at why an Armenian protest leader was detained, so a lot of protests here. Abdi will be talking about the latest on the bombing in Kabul and the situation in Afghanistan. I've, of course, got a Financial News of the Week update for you, and as always, Tash also has a Brexit update for you. But first, we're going to explain a bit about Warwick Congress, who we are, what we do, and how we do it.
Warwick Congress is one of the fastest growing student-run initiatives in the UK, aiming to unite the disciplines of finance, economics, politics and law into a single platform. To stay up to date with everything we do, including articles and our exclusive podcasts, sign up for free membership on our website at www.warwickcongress.com.
Our hope is that Warwick Congress Weekly can inform our listeners, and if you have any questions, queries or opinions, please message in and let us know. You can do so by going to www.radio.warwick.ac.uk and pressing the message tab in the top right corner, and you can also tweet at raw 1251 AM. So we begin with Nicaragua and the anti-government protests causing political upheaval within the country. Violent protests have spread across Nicaragua in response to government reforms of the social security system, and there have been significant calls for President Ortega to step down. Riot police clashed with protesters in the capital Managua on Wednesday, and protests have continued ever since, signalling the biggest crisis of Ortega's administration. The unrest killed at least 8 people and sparked looting and panic buying in the state. The protests are a response to the Sandinista National Liberation Government's decision to push through reforms to the social security and welfare system, and the reforms, which went into effect on Wednesday, apply a 5% tax to old age and disability pensions and increase the contributions paid by both employees and employers. There are those within Nicaraguan society who feel that the reforms are being used to force pensioners and workers for the mismanagement of the consecutive governments of the INSS, the country's National Security Institute. Allegations have been made that the government have used the INSS as a means of obtaining petty cash.
I mean, this all sounds quite hectic, so what's been the kind of government response to this situation?
Well, Ortega's response has seen him attempt to cool tensions, and he announced on Sunday that the government would reverse its decision. Ortega addressed the situation by saying, "The previous resolution of April 16, 2018, which was the resolution that kicked off this whole situation, is being revoked, cancelled, put aside." Although Ortega reaffirmed talks would be held to draft a new plan to strengthen the social security system. As you can imagine, Ortega's government have been condemned widely, especially by the US government and business leaders. The US State Department on Sunday called for broad-based dialogue to end the dispute and restore respect for human rights, urging the government to let the media operate freely. This was in response to the reports that the police have used excessive force and footage circling on social media of a reporter being shot and killed on Facebook Live.
So is this an isolated incident, or is this kind of part of a wider problem with Daniel Ortega and his government?
Well, despite Nicaragua being one of the more stable countries in the region and having benefited from steady economic growth, these protests have again highlighted the alarming influence of President Ortega. Recent elections have seen Ortega take control of the country's National Assembly, although what is worrying is the alleged corruption and fraud that allowed him to be re-elected. Also, protests aren't anything new to Nicaragua, and police violence and repression has been seen before. In June 2013, another protest related to the social security system, police stood idly by as a group of pro-government supporters violently broke up a demonstration in support of pension rights for the elderly. Looking forward, the worry is that President Ortega and his wife, who is also the country's vice president, are forming a family dictatorship. With Ortega controlling all branches of government and having the powerful institutions like the army and police at his disposal, many are feeling that Ortega will continue to play by his own rules. And the result may be political upheaval, and that will turn Nicaragua into Honduras, where organised crime fuels widespread violence. But in an attempt to avoid widespread violence, we have an update on North Korea.
Yeah, so from one president to another, the US administration officials are preparing for an unprecedented summit between President Donald Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-Un, which is the first ever meeting between a serving US president and North Korean leader. And basic details such as when and where the summit will take place are kind of still being worked out. But Trump has said that the meeting could take place as soon as May or June if he's confident that it will deliver the desired result of North Korea scrapping its nuclear weapons program for good.
How likely do you think, then, that the existence of a non-nuclear North Korea actually is given? How much value do you place with Kim Jong-Un upon having a nuclear weapons program?
Yeah, well, the prospect of North Korea scrapping its weapons program was boosted on Saturday when Kim announced an end to nuclear missiles tests, saying that North Korea was scrapping its test site and pursuing economic growth and peace instead. With US and South Korean officials stating that Kim is willing to discuss denuclearization, but that he hasn't said anything about giving up his existing nuclear weapons. So it looks like it's more likely that North Korea will kind of stop producing and testing new ones rather than kind of giving them up completely. Also, quite interestingly, getting Pyongyang to abandon its nuclear missile program has been the aim of kind of all international negotiations since the early 1990s. So whilst this summit is obviously a huge step forward towards denuclearization, it's unsurprising that many leaders are sceptical of how successful it's actually going to be, with Trump having expressed doubts over North Korea's intentions behind the summit, stating on Sunday that the prospect of a nuclear war with North Korea is far from being resolved. And whilst analysts believe that South Korea's progressive president Moon Jae-in will push for sanctions relief as a way to kind of further encourage this diplomatic process, the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is adamant that North Korea shouldn't be rewarded with any economic concessions for responding to this dialogue, and argued instead that kind of maximum pressure should be maintained. So there's kind of discrepancies there between how sort of relations with North Korea should move forward. And this comes at a time when Trump has promised Abe to help return Japanese captives currently believed to be held by the North Korean regime. And the Japanese government believes that as many as 50 people were abducted and held in North Korea between the 1970s and the 1980s, some of whom may still be alive. So clearly tensions still exist there. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out in the next few weeks, and whether tensions between Trump and Kim Jong-un can actually be resolved. And obviously this is a huge story, so we'll keep you updated as it progresses.
And another area that has caused a lot of tension between President Trump and another Asian nation is China. And as we've seen over the last month, threats of tariffs and a looming potential trade war have come to fruition. And it's something that we wrote about, or Abdi wrote about a few weeks ago. So check out that article for a full, history on the trade dispute at warwickcongress.com for free. But in short, tensions have been escalating as Trump accused China of unfair trade practices and pressed for a reduction in the US's $375 billion trade deficit with China. And President Trump is threatening to impose tariffs on as much as $150 billion worth of Chinese imports to punish China for alleged intellectual property theft. If the US follows through, China has vowed to impose retaliatory tariffs on everything from American airplanes to soybeans. But instead of reaching a boiling point, as was widely expected, the dispute appears to be cooling. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, formerly of Goldman Sachs, may be going to China for talks, saying, "A trip is under consideration. I'm not going to make a comment on timing, nor do I have anything confirmed." And Mnuchin has said he's cautiously optimistic of reaching an agreement with China that bridges their differences over trade. And China's Ministry of Commerce has welcomed the move from Mnuchin.
So, Kev, this all sounds quite positive then.
Yeah, well, Guy Xingzi, who's an analyst at Bank of China's Institute of International Finance, which is in Beijing, has said that we shouldn't expect too much from the visit, saying it's likely that they come and demand a price that's too high for China. Then the two sides just end on a sour note and the trade war continues. I'm not optimistic, as it seems that Trump himself doesn't know what he wants to get from China. So, though a sign of thawing relations has been seen on another front, Steve Mnuchin has said China has been very helpful in supporting US sanctions against North Korea, and he welcomed Kim's suspension of nuclear weapons testing that was announced on the same day that Tash talked about earlier. But according to Guy Xingzi, we don't really know where this is going to end up. Meanwhile, an Armenian leader has been detained in the wake of protests in Armenia?
Yeah, so thousands of anti-government protesters rallied the Armenian capital, Yerevan, after riot police seized their leader. The opposition MP, Nikol Pashinyan, was arrested after televised talks with Prime Minister Sargsyan collapsed.
So what caused Pashinyan to be detained?
Well, in a tense exchange during the talks, Pashinyan insisted that the Prime Minister should quit, with Mr. Sargsyan accusing him of blackmail. Prime Minister Sargsyan said that this is not a dialogue, this is blackmail, and just kind of left the talks. And as well as Mr. Pashinyan, 2 other opposition politicians and some 200 demonstrators have been held. And this kind of means that the protest movement is currently without political leadership at the current moment in time.
So how the protesters reacted to the detaining of the opposition leader?
Well, protesters have filled the square, holding placards that read, "I am Nikol," and they've been chanting his name kind of in support. With one protester who was a university student explaining that her and her friends are not attending classes, as that's her way of showing that this new government, that we want change, claiming that the protests are peaceful and don't really want any violence occurring. And they stated that we don't want the police to be against us. And the EU, which has a partnership agreement with Armenia, called on all sides to show restraint and act responsibly.
There's quite a lot of anger going around, isn't there? So why is there so much anger directed at Sir Sargsyan?
Well, the Prime Minister's been accused of failing to address continuing tensions with Azerbaijan and Turkey, as well as widespread poverty at home. And Sargsyan also ran for Prime Minister despite promising that he wouldn't, and he's been Prime Minister since 2008. And his government is also criticised for its close relationship with Russia, with Armenia being valuable to developments in Russia as it's its biggest trading partner after the EU and a major destination for its migrant workers. And the BBC's Armenian affairs analyst has said that however the crisis plays out, there is little or no foreign policy dimension. And it's not really about Russia or Europe, it's kind of more about local politics and economics.
Meanwhile, there has unfortunately been quite a significant terrorist attack in Afghanistan in the build-up to elections they have later this year.
Yeah, Kev. There's been a bombing in Kabul. A suicide bomber killed 57 people and wounded 119 on Sunday. The attack happened outside a voter registration office in the Afghan capital. And it was immediately claimed by Islamic State. General Daoud Amin said that the bomber targeted hundreds of civilians who were queuing up to receive national identification cards to vote in the elections, which are due to take place in October. So it signals quite a clear attack on the Afghan people and their right to vote, really.
So what was the immediate reaction and aftermath of the attack?
So a large explosion was heard throughout the city. It shattered loads of windows, and you could hear the blast from miles away. The explosion itself happened in a Shia majority neighbourhood, and in the ISIS statement, the bomber said it targeted what they called a Shia apostates. Police immediately blocked all the roads leading up to the blast, with only ambulance crews allowed in, and hundreds of people taken to the nearest hospital. This latest bombing has once again sort of raised security issues in the country, with many Afghans worrying that the government can't protect them, and it's up to them to pretty much arm themselves. There are also worries that this attack will harm voter turnout, with many voters being too scared to go to the poll in October.
And you can imagine that's probably the aim from the Islamic State point of view. But how have Afghan citizens been hit by suicide attacks over the last few years?
Well, it never seems to end for the Afghan people, unfortunately. And ever since the end of the US and NATO combat mission, the Afghan government has struggled to contain civilian attacks, from first the Taliban, but now ISIS. Both groups regularly attack the Afghan people, and they also target Shia minority sort of areas, but also the country's security forces. For example, last week, militants killed 3 police officers responsible for guarding voter registration offices in 2 provinces. The potential then for more deadly attacks in run-up to October elections is quite high, and next year's presidential elections will certainly worry the authorities, and ISIS pose a real threat to the country's fledgling democracy.
So this is a story that is probably going to keep unravelling as we head towards October, so we will keep you updated with that. As always, we have a segment on financial news of the week for you. The Shanghai Stock Exchange has signed a memorandum of understanding with the United Arab Emirates to open an international exchange alongside the Abu Dhabi global market. Specifics weren't given about which instruments the new venture would trade or when it might open, but the platform intends to offer endless opportunities to support businesses and investors along the Belt and Road. This is in line with China's large Belt and Road initiative that we brought you news on earlier in the year. Alphabet shares dipped slightly in after-hours trading on Monday as strong growth in ad sales on Google Search and on YouTube were not enough to offset a surge in costs in the first quarter. The results also came with regulators considering getting tougher on internet privacy. Net profit still jumped 73% to an eye-watering $9.4 billion, up from $5.4 billion in the same period a year ago, so Q1 2017. With Alphabet getting a multi-billion-dollar boost from the company's stakes in startups that include Uber. Ryanair has finalised an order for an additional 25 high-capacity Boeing 737 MAX 8 airplanes, worth $3 billion at current list prices. The Irish low-cost carrier is the largest 737-800 customer in the world and the largest Boeing operator in Europe. Last month, Ryanair took delivery of its 500th next-generation 737 and has now ordered more than 650 Boeing airplanes, so quite the sizable fleet there. And Mexico has reached an agreement in principle to modernise an existing free trade deal with the EU, seeking to diversify away from dependence on an increasingly hostile US. The new deal will end Mexican tariffs on European food and beverages, allow the bloc to sell more services in Mexico, and include a pledge by both sides to include protections for their workers and the environment. Meanwhile, we do have an update for you on the Iran nuclear deal.
Yes, we do. And President Trump gets another honourable mention. So he once again has cast doubt on whether he will certify Iran's nuclear deal. The agreement pretty much dictates that Iran will limit its nuclear program to non-military purposes. Trump previously has said that he would scrap what is called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, so the JCPOA, which he called the worst deal in history. Quite like Trump to say that, actually. Trump's warning comes before May 12th deadline to renew the deal. He is obliged to renew the waiver on sanctions every 120 days, and the last waiver was signed in September last year. Trump is concerned that Iran pretty much isn't compliant with the deal, despite the UN being happy with Iran's compliance. I think it's been 8 times now. For a bit of context, Iran signed the deal along with several world powers, including the UK, in April 2015, and the deal offered Iran more than $110 billion in sanctions relief and a return to the world economy.
So how has this news kind of been received by other members of the agreement then?
Well, pretty much Emmanuel Macron, before he goes to visit the US quite soon, has come out and said that there's no plan B if the deal falls apart. Macron said, let's preserve this framework rather than some sort of North Korean type situation. And Iran's response to the situation is quite significant here. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani called on the US to uphold the agreement, or in his words, face severe consequences. In a televised speech, Mr. Rouhani said the Iranian government will react firmly if the White House fails to live up to their commitments.
So there are obviously like a number of scenarios that could happen if like Trump decides not to recertify the deal. So can you give us kind of some insights into what these possible scenarios could be?
Yeah, I'll give you 2 options here. One option would be for Iran to accelerate its uranium enrichment program if the US pulls out and continue with its nuclear activities. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, what a name, said that we have put a number of options for ourselves and those options are ready, including options that would involve resuming at much greater speed for their nuclear activity. The second, which is perhaps a less likely option, would be for Iran to engage in military activity. Iran had been talking up their naval power, with Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps chief warning the US against underestimating the country's naval capabilities. Admiral Ali Fadwawi said the enemy should know that the Navy and the IRGC Navy, which act under a single command, are not afraid of threats and stand against bullying anywhere in the world.
So yeah, the US and Iran are also involved in another dispute that's kind of similar to kind of what's going on here. So could you share a little bit more light on that dispute as well?
Yeah, sure. 5 US prisoners, 4 of Iranian descent, are being detained in Iran. Trump has previously tried to negotiate the release of these prisoners, yet the Iranians rebuked the US government negotiations, as they pretty much, in their words, said, learn how to treat other sovereign nations properly. Trump's potential decision to not renew the deal may be an attempt to get Iran back to the negotiation table, although that doesn't look likely as Iran was less than impressed with Trump and the Americans. Still, the Iranians did say that the prisoners could eventually be released if the US changed its rhetoric and approach, with calls for more respect to be shown by President Trump in response to the US calls for regime change in the country.
So another President Trump bonanza there. Meanwhile, in I guess quite a twist of news that we normally cover, we have China has banned imports of waste.
Yeah, so Beijing has banned the imports of waste and has recently extended the ban to include more recyclable materials. So beginning on the 1st of January 2018, China instituted a new policy banning the import of 24 types of solid waste, including types of plastic and unsorted paper. And on Friday, it extended this ban to dozens of more items, including steel waste and used auto parts, as well as parts of old ships.
So what does China's import on waste actually mean for import ban on waste actually mean for other countries?
Well, China has historically kind of been the number one importer of recycling, accounting for 51% of worldwide scrap plastic imports last year. And from Oregon to the United Kingdom, backups of recycling are being reported as businesses struggle to find new destinations for their overly contaminated recycling. And the ban has caused a serious upheaval in the recycling markets around the world, with recycling commodity prices having declined 36% in the first quarter of 2018 alone. And the ban has had terrible consequences in some places, with a town in Australia having been sending recyclable waste to a landfill because it can no longer afford to recycle it. Whilst in the UK, hordes of low-grade plastic have been hanging around in storage, eventually heading for incineration.
But surely this is a positive step for building towards a cleaner environment.
Yeah, so experts say the ban has been a massive wake-up call for countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, Japan, and many others who relied on China to buy and handle their trash for them. And several countries, including the UK, have now kind of started talking about imposing taxes on some plastic items to make people use fewer materials. And others, like Australia, have invested tens of millions of dollars to help local councils with the waste crisis. So it's definitely kind of causing an awakening here.
And what kind of changes could you potentially see in the UK's approach to handling waste?
Well, Simon Ellin, the chief executive of the Recycling Association in the United Kingdom, said the ban is prompting more investment into recycling technologies. And he stated that slowing the recycling process down allows us to produce better quality materials. With companies adopting higher standards and much more stringent processes, there is much more investment in technology. So to Ellen, the ban is a good thing, stating that it's inevitable that in the future other countries will follow China, looking into bringing similar quality standards so that the quality of our material has to be better.
Kev, can you update us then on the Italian election situation and whether we'll see a new government being formed anytime soon?
Yeah, so we brought you news on this just before we left for our Easter break, but talks have continued to take place to no avail, with the latest round of discussions breaking down on Friday between the populist Five Star Movement and the centre-right coalition. These two rivals who came out as the two biggest parties in the election have stood firm on their positions, which has derailed any possible deal to form a government. And this stagnation is testing many Italians' patience with the main parties, since it has now been nearly 2 months since the election took place. And with this most recent setback, it's hard to see any end to this stalemate.
So can you then perhaps give us a summary of what the response has been from various parties involved in these recent setbacks?
Yeah, so the Five Star Movement have cited the presence of Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia party in the centre-right coalition as a problem, and this is because of the Five Star Movement's strong anti-corruption campaign, and Berlusconi's involvement is a major sticking point for them. Forza Italia and Berlusconi have called on the Five Star Movement, called them a danger to the country, and said that they are not a democratic party and instead are a party for the unemployed. Berlusconi's comments have angered his main partner in the centre-right coalition, Lega, and its leader Matteo Salvini threatened to walk away from the centre-right coalition after talks broke down. So this war of words will likely not yield any positive result.
Is there then a possibility that any other deal can be reached?
Well, after a weekend of reflection, the possibility of a coalition between the Five Star Movement and the current ruling party, the Democratic Party, who are centre-left, does exist. In the wake of this news, the current Democratic President, Sergio Mattarella, asked Lower House Speaker Robert Fico to find out whether the Five Star Movement and the Democratic Party could enter a coalition in an attempt to break up the current long impasse. And more talks will be held to see if a deal can be hammered out, but it could again take weeks, and as always, we will keep you updated on that. And our weekly Brexit update is here with Tash. I feel like we need to get you a jingle or something.
I feel like we should have like the national anthem play or something, like just before I start talking.
There we go, Brexit.
Right, so the government has suffered another defeat on its flagship Brexit bill in the House of Lords after peers voted to keep a key EU human rights charter as part of British law. With the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights being backed by a majority of 71 peers, with 316 supporting the motion and 245 opposing it. And this is actually the third major defeat the government has suffered on its EU withdrawal bill in less than a week, with the bill aiming to transfer almost all European statutes into UK law when Britain eventually, if ever, leaves the EU. And it's expected that this latest defeat could force the government to soften its stance on Brexit when the bill does return to the House of Commons, with ministers having insisted that retaining the Charter of Fundamental Rights is unnecessary, as the protection it offers will be included elsewhere in the EU withdrawal bill.
So what does the Charter actually ensure?
Well, the Charter of Fundamental Rights contains a wide range of protections, including the right to a private life, freedom of speech, equality provisions and employment rights, governing how workers are treated, and is generally slightly broader in its provisions than the European Convention on Human Rights, which is kind of already part of UK law through the Human Rights Act. And Lord Pannick, who co-sponsored the amendment, has adamantly stated that excluding the Charter from UK law after Brexit would be a recipe for confusion, stating that the only reason the government doesn't want to include it in the EU withdrawal bill is because the government is suspicious of the very concept of fundamental rights. Direct quote there. With Pannick fearing that the EU withdrawal bill could be used as an excuse to kind of reduce the legal rights which we all enjoy against the state. So there's clearly a lot of tension between the House of Lords and the government over how Brexit is kind of currently being handled. And numerous human rights campaigners have supported the government's defeat, with Martha Spurrier, director of the charity Liberty, stating that this defeat marks a huge victory for human rights and common sense. The Lords have sent a clear message to the government that you can't use Brexit to take away people's rights. So another week, more issues over Brexit.
And unfortunately, that is all we have time for this week. But before we leave you, we do have a summary of all the stories that we have covered today. Nicaragua has been hit with protests over the last week against proposed reforms to the national security system. President Ortega has now reversed his decision, but in the US, business leaders and human rights organizations have condemned the Ortega government's handling of the situation. US administration officials are preparing an unprecedented summit between President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-Un to discuss North Korea's potential denuclearization after months of rising tensions between the two leaders. Whilst Kim has stated that he wants to see an end to his nuclear program in favor of pursuing economic growth and peace instead, numerous world leaders remain skeptical as to what his real intentions behind the summit are. And the ongoing trade dispute between China and the US could be cooling instead of bubbling over, as previously expected, following sharp announcement of tariffs from both states. US Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is expected to make a visit to China in order to negotiate a solution to the dispute, although analysts do not expect any firm ground to be established during the visit.
Protesters have filled the square in Armenia's capital as the leader of the opposition party has been detained. The result of tense sort of televised talks have left the Prime Minister to get up and leave. Beijing has extended its ban on imports of waste to include more varieties of recyclable materials. The ban has caused a serious upheaval in the recycling markets around the world. Some experts consider the ban to be a positive step that will encourage investment into recycling technologies. An Islamic State suicide attack has killed 57 people outside a voter registration centre in the Afghan capital of Kabul, which has come in the run-up to elections in October in the country.
President Trump has threatened to not certify the Iran nuclear deal in a move that could have detrimental consequences. World leaders, including Emmanuel Macron, have called on Trump to reconsider the decision amidst fears that Iran will abandon the deal and accelerate its nuclear activity. Italian government talks still continue, with discussions between the Five Star Movement and the centre-right coalition breaking down. However, the possibility for a Five Star and centre-left coalition has increased. And finally, the government has suffered another defeat on its flagship Brexit bill in the House of Lords after peers voted to keep a key EU human rights charter as part of British law, in a move that is expected to force the government to soften its stance on Brexit and ensure a greater protection of human rights.
We've also got some quite exciting Warwick Congress news, because Warwick Congress 2019 is hosting its first event on the 30th of April. The event is called The Financialisation of Climate Risk and will run from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock in L5 on campus at Warwick University, which you can find in the Science Concourse. To give you a little background on the event, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Discourse recommendations were published in June 2017, and those recommendations mark a new and distinctive phase in the response to climate change, one with its own vocabulary, opportunities, and risks. So the presentation will offer an up-to-date summary of the process involved, the strengths and weaknesses of the recommendations, an insight into how oil and gas companies are responding, and where new research may be called for. You can find the event page on our Facebook page, so get yourselves over there for more information and invite your friends, because it's definitely going to be an insightful evening. Don't forget to become a member of Warwick Congress, and it's never been easier to do so. With exclusive interviews, articles, and careers events for our members, sign up now at www.warwickcongress.com. You've been listening to Warwick Congress Weekly. We'll be back at the same time next week.